going to interrupt your conversations. I apologize.
Okay, folks, I need you to take notes on the results.
Yeah. I'd like to gather us back together, and I'm glad you're having some good, stimulating conversation. We'd like to actually hear from each table about one or both of these things. So we have about 10 minutes. We could go a little longer than that, but we have a microphone here, and since we're recording, we're going to go ahead and pass that mic around. So would one of the tables like to go first? Okay.
Who's the spokesperson?
Core elements of student success culture, what we talked about was campus connections, having the student feel an affiliation and connectedness with campus. We called it belonging, a sense of belonging through engagement, creating that sense of that real supportive, culturally sensitive environment, and having that continuity throughout their lifespan at the university. So they have a connectedness and someone to go to and always feeling like they have that support. And then academic success, support, whether it's mentoring, tutoring, supplemental instruction, all of those high impact practices. Campus leadership, certainly the messaging that they're important, that student success is important. And then accountability, always doing an assessment on effectiveness of operations and of processes so that students are successful. Do you want the second part too?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay,
We'd love to know one big barrier.
the one critical issue we talked about was instructional and curricular design, and that we talked about is, does our instruction line up in terms of program of studies and making sure that they can graduate within the 4-year period. And a lot of the obstacles that we talked about were course budget, resources, some of it being faculty buy-in, so that they have an understanding of what it takes for students to succeed, and not necessarily blaming the students and being as an inherent issue within the student themselves, but perhaps institutional and operational and otherwise. And then promotion and tenure doesn't always value faculty's contributions to student success, so and that's all wrapped up in that messaging to faculty and buy-in.
Great, thank you. Another table? One critical issue and maybe one barrier?
Most of our discussion was about getting students to actually take 15 credits every term, whether that's through branding efforts of, finish in 4 or, 15 for all or something. One interesting take of saying that if the minimum for financial aid is 12, making the minimum for a campus job 15, to say, well, yes, we'll let you get financial aid at 12, but everyone should be taking 15, and if you aren't taking 15, you're not full-time enough to get a campus job, to help spread that culture of you should be taking this many hours. We also spent a lot of time discussing financial implications and how tuition fits into this, and then we're surprised when you said, oh, it's time, and we hadn't talked about it, the other thing at all yet.
Others?
I've got
Thanks, Sherry.
We talked a little bit about, for critical issue, I guess some comments around culture. Culture is soft and sometimes tough to see. So we talked about it, at least at Portland State, in terms of some work around advising reform and how we feel like that's trying to help shift our culture. So one of the critical issues is around alignment. People, resources, practices, synergies in advising reform. And then an obstacle or challenge is how do we build advisor capacity so that as we start to harness more of the power of some of the predictive analytics and proactive advising, how do we support 50, 60 advisors from around campus, professional advisors, in starting to use practices and outreach strategies and other interventions that honor the kind of culture we want to have around sensitivity and acknowledging where students are and some of the obstacles that they face.
Thank you. Over here, Sherry.
Oh, okay, great.
Thanks.
Good morning. excuse me, we talked a lot about starting the conversation, getting support coming from the president down through all of the faculty, and including setting the scene of valuing student success as a really important first step in any kind of setting that we're trying to use student success. Then we also talked about tools and the kinds of tools you can use. And then I talked a lot about faculty buy-in, because that's a particular interest of mine. I asked the question, how many of you have a vice president for research? Everyone raised their hand. How many of you have a vice president for community engagement? A few people raised their hand. How many people have a vice provost or vice president level focus on teaching? No one raised their hand. So my take on that is that improving and making teaching part of the administrative structure is a really important first step in getting faculty, getting the role of teaching in the university to be raised. Because I think a lot of universities have done a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of improving student success, but improving and making the value of teaching much higher within the university is the next thing that we really should be focusing on.
Thank you. Any others in the back?
Yeah, we talked about really the complexity of the issue and how pervasive it was really in every aspect of the institution, and we talked about that in ways that were both top-down and bottom-up. So from the top down, we talked about some of the things that were already said about the necessity of a clear mandate from the very top of the institution, and the consistency of that mandate, and also the skillfulness of the communication that easy when you're starting to launch a culture change to say one thing with your words and another thing with your tone, and to make sure that really the whole the way that you're communicating, not just your content, is carefully thought through. And then from the bottom-up perspective, we really talked about the challenges of understanding the student experience, perhaps even at the the emotional and the developmental level, why they're sitting at this place in the classroom and not up in front, and how difficult it is to really connect that low-level granularity to our institutional interventions to support students.
Thank you. Sure.
Interestingly, we represent two universities that are about 20 miles apart. One is a very large university in the UT system, and mine is a startup university in the UNT system. But our students come from basically in the same constituencies: a smaller cohort of traditional students, a large cohort of community college transfers, and then an almost equally large group of non-traditional students coming back to get their degrees. I think one indicator of success at both places is having the discipline at the universities to wait for students who get their associate degrees, because if they get their associate degrees at community college, then they are almost 90% likely to graduate. If they don't, then it's a much lower percentage of students who graduate. So knowing those trends enables you to make certain decisions. Also building really close relationships with those community college, so that if they do come without an associate's degree, then work with them with a reverse. We both have robust reverse transfer programs that allows the students, while they're going to the four-year institute, to get their associate degrees, which helps the community college. The other thing is that we're also working with the community college districts in our respective counties to improve their advising, because too many times these students come with 90, 100, 120 hours. They've just been aimlessly rolling around these community colleges. So by the time they get there, they don't have any financial aid left. And I would say the biggest obstacle right now is, because of these three constituencies, they demand very different things, different hours. And so trying to align those serving the interests of those constituencies while still having a sense of a cohesive university is important. And for the non-traditionals, obviously you need, we've had to develop later hours and weekend hours. So those are
Great.
some of the things.
Thank you. Have we heard from everyone that wanted to contribute? Sherry, did you have anything to add?
Didn't know if you wanted to add from our, you'll be up there, so.
Okay. Our panelists will take a pause.
Pick just that one table, but they don't want to.
Okay.
Okay. You wanna-
Great. Well, excellent ideas. It's definitely a good place to start the day and a good place to frame the panel. I'll invite our panelists to come on up to the front. This is really the way we want to frame the whole discussion on completion grants, is keeping in mind the notion of the campus culture focused on student success. And again, I want to thank our panelists for being with us here today. And the way we're going to do this next session is I'll give each of them an opportunity to introduce themselves. And we're going to hear from each of them for just a little bit under 10 minutes, addressing some of the key aspects of their completion grants. And then I'll give you opportunities for Q&A in between maybe every second speaker. So why don't you just keep a pen handy and note the things you want to ask follow-up questions on. We'll be sure to do that in between and at the end. I'll move it forward for us. The slides, yeah. We're starting with you. Yes, we're going to go ahead and get started with University of Washington at Tacoma.
Good morning. Now, I'm from the West Coast, and it's still 6 o'clock my time, so good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Cedric Howard, the Vice Chancellor for Student Enrollment Services at University of Washington, Tacoma. Oftentimes when we begin to discuss completion and success, for me, it's oftentimes better to understand not just the content, but also the context by which the content is being demonstrated. And so to frame some of the discussions that some of my remarks, I would like to just kind of give you a brief overview of University of Washington, Tacoma. If you're not familiar with the Seattle-Tacoma area, Seattle and Tacoma are 32 miles apart, but they're a world of difference. If you look at our institution, we're currently 4,600. Overall, within our institution, 43% of our students are first-generation college students. If you look at our entering freshman class, 68% of those students are first-generation college students. That's in part because the way that we're structured is very similar to the gentleman that I was just hearing. 70% of our incoming new students are transfer students, so they transfer from the community college. That's in part the way the state of Washington is set up. Our institution is 45% students of color. Our graduation rate has increased significantly over the last 3 years, in part because we begin to look at the persistence rates rather than just looking at graduation rates. And that's a bit of context. One of the things that we did as it relates to our completion grant was not focus on completion once they actually come to UW Tacoma. Tacoma, the city of